The stone struck Clara's shoulder with a sickening crack, sending her stumbling backward into the dusty street. Pain shot through her arm like lightning, but the physical agony paled against the raw terror coursing through her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs as another rock whizzed past her ear close enough that she felt the displaced air. Whore Jezebel. Martha Henley's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. The baker's wife stood at the front of the mob, her flour-dusted apron stark against her black dress, another stone already clutched in her meaty fist. "You've brought nothing but sin and corruption to our godly town." Clara's breath came in short, desperate gasps as she pressed her back against the weathered wall of Peterson's general store. The crowd surged closer, a mass of twisted faces and pointing fingers. Tom Crenshaw, barely 17, but with eyes hard as granite, spat a stream of tobacco juice that splattered near her feet. "Jalk should have never let trash like you step foot in Millfield." He snarled, his young voice cracking with manufactured authority. "Decent folk got no use for your kind." The wooden planks of the boardwalk dug into Clara's spine as she flattened herself against the building. Somewhere in the crowd, she glimpsed Harlan Boyd's weathered face. His eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to meet her desperate gaze. The man who had brought her here as his mail-order bride now stood silent while his neighbors bayed for her blood. "Please," Clara whispered, but her voice was lost in the roar of condemnation. Another stone grazed her temple, and warm blood trickled down her cheek. The world tilted, colors bleeding together as panic clawed at her throat. Mrs. Ashcroft emerged from the crowd, like an avenging angel, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her pale skin tight across sharp cheekbones. The head of Millfield's Virtue Committee carried herself with the authority of divine judgment, her dark eyes burning with righteous fury. "Citizens of Millfield," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. "We gather today to cleanse our community of corruption. This woman," she pointed a bony finger at Clara, "has brought shame upon the Boyd family and threatened the very fabric of our Christian society." Clara's legs gave way, and she slid down the wall until she sat in the dust, her dark skirt pooling around her like spilled ink. The crowd pressed closer, close enough that she could smell their sweat, and hatred could see the satisfaction in their eyes as they watched her break. "No, brand her," someone shouted from the back. "Mark her so decent folk know what she is." The suggestion rippled through the mob like wildfire, voices rising in eager agreement. Clara felt the last of her strength drain away as she realized there would be no rescue, no intervention. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, in a town that had already decided her fate. Martha Henley stepped forward, clutching a piece of red cloth that seemed to burn in the harsh morning light. "Let this scarlet letter mark your shame," she declared, pinning the fabric to Clara's torn shawl with violent satisfaction. "Let all who see you know what you are, a corrupted woman who destroys everything she touches." Clara had arrived in Millfield 3 months ago, with hope blooming in her chest and dreams of building a family with Harlan Boyd and his 2 young children. She had answered his advertisement for a wife traveling by train from St. Louis, with nothing but a carpet bag and the promise of a new beginning. The letter he had written spoke of loneliness, of needing a mother for his children after his wife's death, of a simple life in a growing frontier town. What she found instead was suspicion that curdled into hatred, whispers that grew into accusations, and a man too weak to defend the woman he had brought into his home. The children, 8-year-old Nellie and 6-year-old Sam, had warmed to her quickly, but their affection only seemed to fuel the town's resentment. Mrs. Ashcroft had declared that Clara was unnaturally winning over the children, using wicked feminine wiles to corrupt their innocent hearts. The breaking point had come when Dr. Bradley Morrison examined Nellie for a fever and declared she was developing too quickly for a girl her age. In hushed conversations that Clara was never meant to overhear, the good doctor suggested that the child was being exposed to immoral influences that were affecting her natural development. Mrs. Ashcroft had seized upon this pronouncement as proof of Clara's corrupting presence. Within days, the whispers had grown into open accusations. Clara was encouraging inappropriate behavior, they said. She was teaching the children to question their father's authority. She was introducing foreign ideas that threatened the community's values. When Nellie had been caught defending Clara against a group of older children, Mrs. Ashcroft declared it proof positive that the woman was turning the child against proper Christian society. Now sitting in the dust with blood drying on her face and the scarlet letter burning against her chest, Clara understood that there had never been any hope of acceptance. She had been brought to Millfield not as a bride, but as a sacrifice, a scapegoat for all the town's fears and failures. As the crowd finally began to disperse, satisfied with their morning's work, Clara remained slumped against the store wall. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day in the Nevada territory. She could feel the weight of watching eyes from behind curtained windows, could sense the satisfaction radiating from those who had participated in her humiliation. Harlan approached slowly, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each reluctant step. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You can't stay at the house anymore," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The children, it's not safe for them to be seen with you." Clara looked up at him, seeing clearly for the first time the weakness that she had mistaken for kindness in his letters. This was a man who would sacrifice anyone to maintain his standing in the community. She had been imported not as a partner, but as expendable goods. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Harlan shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting her gaze for just a moment before looking away again. "There's the old supply shed behind the ranch. You can stay there for now, until we figure something else out." Clara almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After being publicly branded as a whore and driven from the home she had tried to make her own, she was being offered the privilege of sleeping in a storage shed like discarded equipment. And what about Nellie and Sam? She asked, thinking of the two children who had become the brightest part of her new life. Will I ever see them again? Harlan's jaw tightened. Mrs. Ashcroft thinks it's best if you have no contact with them. For their own good. The words hit Clara like another stone to the chest. In the space of a single morning, she had lost not just her home and her standing in the community, but the two small souls who had given her purpose. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its completeness. As Harlan walked away without another word, Clara finally found the strength to pull herself to her feet. Her shoulder throbbed where the first stone had struck, and her head pounded from the blow to her temple. But she forced herself to stand straight. If this town wanted to see her as a pariah, then she would at least be a dignified one. The supply shed behind the Boyd Ranch was barely larger than a prison cell filled with rusted tools and moldering grain sacks. A single small window let in just enough light to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the stifling air. Clara made herself a bed from empty burlap sacks and tried not to think about the life she had left behind in St. Louis or the future she had imagined building in Millfield. That night, as she lay on her makeshift bed, listening to the wind howl across the desert, Clara heard a soft scratching at the shed door. She sat up, heart-pounding, fearing another confrontation with the townspeople. Instead, she found Nellie and Sam peering through the crack in the door, their young faces etched with confusion and worry. "Miss Clara," Nellie whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "We snuck out after Papa went to sleep. Are you hurt?" Clara's heart broke all over again as she knelt down to embrace the children. Sam immediately burrowed into her arms, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Nellie, trying to be brave, like the little woman she was becoming, stood stiffly but let Clara smooth her tangled hair. "We heard what they said about you." Nellie continued, her voice tight with anger that seemed far too mature for her 8 years. Mrs. Ashcroft told Papa that you were teaching us wicked things, but you never did anything bad. You just taught us how to read better and how to make bread that doesn't burn. Some people see wickedness where there isn't any, Clara said softly, choosing her words carefully. They're scared of things they don't understand. But you're not wicked, Sam said fiercely, his small fists clenched. You sing us songs and tell us stories about faraway places. You make everything better. Clara held the children close, breathing in their familiar scent of soap and childhood innocence. For a moment, she let herself imagine that she could simply take them and run escape to some place where they could be a family, without the weight of community judgment crushing down on them. But she knew that such dreams were as insubstantial as the dust that coated everything in this harsh land. You both need to go back to the house, she said finally, though every word felt like swallowing glass. If your father finds out you were here, it will only make things worse. We don't want to leave you alone. Nellie protested, her composure finally cracking. It's not fair. None of this is fair. No. Clara agreed. It isn't fair. But life rarely is, especially for women in places like this. The best we can do is try to protect the people we love, even when it means making sacrifices we don't want to make. As the children reluctantly returned to the house, Clara remained kneeling by the shed door, watching their small figures disappear into the darkness. She had no way of knowing that this would be one of the last peaceful moments she would have for a very long time, or that forces were already moving in the shadows that would soon threaten not just her own life, but the lives of the children she had come to love. 3 days after her public humiliation, Clara was jolted awake by the sound of horses approaching the ranch. Through the grimy window of the shed, she could see riders silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness. Something about their furtive movements set her nerves on edge, and she pressed herself against the wall, trying to remain invisible. The voices that drifted across the yard were hushed but urgent, and Clara caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Someone mentioned the woman and making an example. Another voice, younger and eager, suggested teaching her a lesson she won't forget. Clara recognized the voices of Tom Crenshaw and 2 of his friends, Pike Matthews and Jake Briggs, young men who had appointed themselves as enforcers of the town's moral standards. Pike was known for his cunning cruelty, always finding ways to torment those weaker than himself, while maintaining plausible deniability. Briggs, slower-witted, but eager to please, followed Pike's lead in all things. Nash said we should handle this quiet-like. Pike was saying, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Can't have the whole territory thinking Millfield tolerates loose women. The mention of Vern Nash sent ice through Clara's veins. Nash was the richest man in 3 counties, owner of silver mines and cattle ranches that stretched for miles across the territory. He was also the kind of man who expected his will to be law, regardless of what that will might be. If Nash had decided that Clara was a problem that needed solving, then her situation had just become far more dangerous than simple social ostracism. What exactly did he say to do with her? Tom asked, and Clara could hear the excitement barely contained in his young voice. Said she needs to understand her place, Pike replied. Said maybe a trip out to the desert would help clear her head. A lot of ways a person can get lost out there, if you take my meaning. Clara didn't need Pike to elaborate on his meaning. The Nevada desert was littered with the bones of people who had wandered off the known trails, whether by accident or design. If these men took her out into that vast wasteland, she would never be seen again, and no one in Millfield would ask too many questions about what had happened to the corrupted woman who had disrupted their peaceful community. Moving as quietly as she could, Clara began gathering her few possessions. She had no illusions about her chances of escaping 3 mounted men in open country, but she had to try. The alternative was to wait passively for her own murder. As she reached for the door handle, the shed suddenly exploded inward. Pike Matthews stood in the doorway, his narrow face split by a grin that revealed yellowed teeth. Behind him, Tom and Briggs blocked any hope of escape. "You... well," Pike drawled, stepping into the cramped space. "Looks like our little bird was fixing to fly the coop. Good thing we got here when we did." Clara backed against the far wall, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. "What do you want?" she managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. "Ma want?" Pike laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Why we want to help you, Miss Clara. See, word around town is that you've been having some trouble fitting in with decent society. Mr. Nash, being the generous man he is, thought maybe you'd benefit from some time to reflect on your choices." "Time to reflect," Clara repeated, stalling while her mind raced for any possible escape. "Out in the desert," Tom added eagerly, "where you can commune with nature and think about all the ways you've disappointed the good people of Millfield." Briggs, apparently growing impatient with the conversation, stepped forward and grabbed Clara's arm with painful force. "Enough talking. Let's get this done." Clara jerked away from his grasp, but there was nowhere to run in the confined space. "Wait," she said desperately. "If you're going to kill me, at least tell me why. What have I actually done to deserve this?" Pike's grin widened. "Besides being a whore, besides corrupting innocent children, besides bringing shame on a decent family." He shook his head mockingly. "Some folks just don't know when they're not wanted. I'm not a whore," Clara said quietly, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. "I came here to be a wife and mother. I've done nothing but try to help this family and this community." "Help?" Tom laughed harshly. "You call turning children against their betters helping. You call filling their heads with fancy ideas about reading and writing. Helping girls don't need book learning. They need to learn their place just like you need to learn yours." The casual dismissal of everything Clara valued, education growth. The potential she saw in Nellie and Sam struck her like a physical blow. She realized that her crime wasn't anything she had done, but simply what she represented: change, progress, the possibility that life in Millfield might become something more than an endless cycle of ignorance and fear. "And what if I refuse to go with you?" she asked, though she knew the question was futile. Pike's expression turned cold. "Then we drag you. Makes no difference to us whether you walk to your horse or get thrown over it like a sack of grain." Clara looked at the three young men blocking her path and made a desperate calculation. Pike was the leader, the one the others looked to for direction. If she could somehow incapacitate him, she might have a chance of escaping in the confusion. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. Pretending to surrender, Clara let her shoulders slump in defeat. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you. Just let me get my shawl." As she reached for the woolen garment hanging on a nail by the door, Clara's fingers closed around the handle of a rusty hammer that Harlan had left among his tools. Without giving herself time to think, she spun around and swung the hammer at Pike's head with all the strength desperation could give her. The blow caught him across the temple, and he went down hard, blood streaming from the gash Clara's desperate strike had opened. Tom and Briggs stood frozen for a crucial moment, shocked by the sudden violence from someone they had seen as helpless prey. Clara didn't wait for them to recover. She pushed past them and ran into the pre-dawn darkness, her feet flying across the uneven ground as shouts erupted behind her. She could hear them scrambling to mount their horses, could hear Pike's voice thick with pain and rage, ordering them to run her down. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no real shelter, but Clara ran anyway. Behind her, the thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they caught her. Still, she pushed herself harder, driven by the primal need to survive, and the desperate hope that somehow, someway, she might find help. It was Tom Crenshaw who finally rode her down his horse, easily outpacing her exhausted flight. He dismounted with a savage grin and backhanded her across the face with enough force to send her sprawling. "That was a mistake, bitch," he snarled, standing over her prone form. "Pike's going to want to make this real slow now." Clara tasted blood in her mouth and felt the world swimming around her from the force of the blow. Through her dazed vision, she could see Pike approaching, one hand pressed to his bleeding head, his face twisted with murderous fury. "You want to fight like a wildcat?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Fine, we'll treat you like one. Briggs, get the rope. We're going to drag her behind the horses until she learns some manners." As the three men prepared to carry out their brutal plan, Clara closed her eyes and thought of Nellie and Sam sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that the woman who had tried to love them was about to disappear forever into the unforgiving desert. She wondered if anyone would ever tell them what had really happened to her, or if they would simply grow up believing that she had abandoned them without a word. The sound of approaching riders made all four of them freeze. Pike cursed under his breath as a group of horsemen emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, their faces hidden in shadow, but their intent unmistakable. These were not more vigilantes come to join in Clara's torment. These were lawmen, and their presence changed everything. At the head of the group rode Marshal Jim Waters, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for swift justice. Behind him rode Deputy Martinez and two other men Clara didn't recognize, all wearing the star and circle badge of the territorial marshals. "Well, well," Marshal Waters said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "What do we have here?" Pike straightened, trying to project confidence, despite the blood still trickling down his face. "Just having a conversation with Miss Clara here, Marshal. Nothing that concerns the law." Waters looked down at Clara, who was still lying in the dirt with blood on her face and her clothes torn from her desperate flight. "That's so, miss, are you all right?" Clara struggled to sit up, her head still spinning from Tom's blow. "They were going to kill me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They said Mr. Nash wanted me taken out to the desert." The marshal's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, miss. You boys want to tell me what this is really about?" "She's lying," Tom said quickly. "She attacked Pike with a hammer. We were just defending ourselves." "Defending yourselves," Waters repeated slowly. "Three grown men with horses and guns defending yourselves against one unarmed woman. In the desert. Before dawn." His tone made it clear exactly what he thought of that explanation. Pike, realizing that their situation was rapidly deteriorating, tried a different approach. "Look, Marshal, this woman has been causing trouble in Millfield for months. She's corrupted the Boyd children, brought shame on a decent family. The community decided she needed to be dealt with. The community offer," Waters said, "doesn't get to decide who lives and dies. That's what the law is for." He turned to his deputies. "Martinez, arrest these three for attempted murder. We'll let a judge sort out their version of community justice." As the deputies moved to take Pike, Tom, and Briggs into custody, Clara felt a wave of relief so intense it left her dizzy. She had been minutes away from a horrible death, and only the intervention of federal law had saved her. But even as she watched her would-be killers being bound and loaded onto horses, she knew that this was far from over. Vern Nash was not a man who accepted failure gracefully. And if he had decided that Clara needed to be eliminated, he would not be deterred by the arrest of three incompetent young men. If anything, this incident would only convince him that more decisive action was needed. Marshal Waters helped Clara to her feet, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss, I'm going to need you to come back to town with us. We'll need your testimony about what happened here, and frankly, it's not safe for you to be out here alone." Clara nodded, though the thought of returning to Millfield filled her with dread. "Marshal, if what they said is true, If Mr. Nash really is behind this, then I'm not safe in town either. Waters studied her for a long moment. Nash is a powerful man, that's true. But he's not above the law, no matter what he might think. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise you. As they rode back toward Millfield, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was riding toward her doom rather than safety. The sun was beginning to rise over the desert, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded her uncomfortably of blood. Behind them, the vast wasteland where she had nearly died stretched endlessly, a reminder of how close she had come to simply vanishing without a trace. The town was already stirring when they arrived, early risers emerging from their homes to begin another day. The sight of the marshal's party with 3 local men in custody drew curious stares and worried whispers. Clara could feel the weight of hostile eyes upon her as word of the night's events began to spread. Mrs. Ashcroft appeared in the doorway of her boarding house, her face pale with shock that quickly transformed into righteous indignation. "Marshal Waters," she called out, her voice carrying across the street. "I trust you're not planning to burden our community with the continued presence of that woman." Waters turned his horse to face her, his expression stern. "Mrs. Ashcroft, that woman is a potential victim of attempted murder. She'll be staying in town under federal protection until we sort this out." Federal protection. Mrs. Ashcroft's voice rose to a near shriek. "For a common whore who has brought nothing but trouble to our peaceful community, I'd be careful about making accusations you can't prove, ma'am," Waters said quietly. "Slander is also against the law." As they continued toward the jail, Clara caught sight of Harlan Boyd standing in front of his house, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Beside him stood Nellie and Sam, their young faces bright with hope at seeing Clara return. She wanted to wave to them to let them know she was all right, but she forced herself to look away. Any contact with the children would only make their situation worse. The Millfield Jail was a small, sturdy building that had been constructed more to hold drunks and minor troublemakers than serious criminals. Marshal Waters led Clara to a small room behind the main office, its single window barred, but its door unlocked. "This is the safest place for you right now," he explained. "I'll post a deputy outside and no one gets in or out without my say-so." Clara looked around the sparse room, taking in the narrow cot and single chair that comprised its furnishings. After the supply shed, it seemed almost luxurious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had simply traded one prison for another. "Marshal," she said as he prepared to leave. "What happens now?" "Those men you arrested, they were just following orders. The real threat is still out there." Waters nodded grimly. "I know, but building a case against Nash is going to take time and evidence. Men like him don't usually get their hands dirty directly. They pay others to do their dirty work. And in the meantime, you stay alive. That's the most important thing right now." After the marshal left, Clara sat on the narrow cot and tried to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from sleeping in a tool shed to nearly being murdered to being placed in protective custody. The whiplash of events left her feeling hollow and disconnected from reality. As the day wore on, she could hear the sounds of normal life continuing outside her window. Wagons rolled past, children played in the street, merchants hawked their wares. It seemed impossible that such ordinary activities could continue while her world had been turned completely upside down. Late in the afternoon, she heard a soft knock at her door. Deputy Martinez peered in his young face, grave with concern. "Miss Clara, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Clara's heart leaped with hope that it might be Nellie or Sam. But the man who entered her room was Dr. Bradley Morrison, the same physician who had started this nightmare with his pronouncements about Nellie's development. Dr. Morrison was a slight man with thinning hair and nervous hands that never seemed to be still. He had arrived in Millfield 6 months ago, claiming to have studied medicine in Boston. and had quickly ingratiated himself with the town's leading citizens. His word carried considerable weight in matters of health and morality. "Miss Clara," he said, wringing his hands as he took the single chair. "I've come to apologize for my role in your current predicament." Clara studied his face, searching for signs of sincerity. "Your role, Doctor—" "My comments about the Boyd girl. I realize now that I may have overreacted. Children develop at different rates, and there was nothing truly concerning about young Nellie's condition. The admission should have brought Clara some satisfaction, but instead, it only deepened her sense of betrayal. Then why did you say what you did? Why did you give Mrs. Ashcroft the ammunition she needed to destroy my life?" Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I was under pressure. Certain people in town made it clear that they expected me to find problems with your influence on the children. I thought if I gave them something minor, something that could be explained away later, it would satisfy them without causing real harm. Without causing real harm. Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "Doctor, I was nearly murdered this morning because of your minor accusation." I know. Dr. Morrison's hands fluttered like agitated birds. "That's why I'm here. I want to help make this right." Clara leaned forward, studying his nervous demeanor. Something about his manner suggested that this visit was about more than simple guilt over his previous actions. "What kind of help are you offering, Doctor?" "Information," he said quietly, glancing toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. "About what's really happening in this town. About why certain people wanted you discredited." Despite her anger at the man, Clara felt a spark of hope. If Dr. Morrison knew something about the forces that had been working against her, it might finally give her a way to fight back. "Tell me," she said simply. Dr. Morrison leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It's not just about you, Miss Clara. There are financial interests involved. Land deals, railroad contracts. Your presence here threatens certain plans that have been in motion for months." "What kind of plans?" "The Central Pacific Railroad is planning to build a spur line through this area. The route they choose will make certain properties incredibly valuable. Nash has been quietly buying up land along the proposed route, but the Boyd Ranch sits right in the middle of the most valuable section." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place, and they needed Harlan to sell his land. Exactly. But with you in the picture helping to stabilize his family situation, he was less likely to make desperate decisions. A man with a happy family doesn't usually sell the land that's been in his family for generations. So they decided to remove me from the equation. First by discrediting you, then by more direct means when that didn't work fast enough. Dr. Morrison's face was pale with fear and guilt. "Miss Clara, I've been a fool and a coward, but I'm not a murderer. When I learned what Nash was planning, I knew I had to warn you." Clara sat back, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just learned. She wasn't just an inconvenient woman who had failed to fit into small-town society. She was an obstacle to a criminal conspiracy that involved railroad corruption and land fraud. "Doctor, are you willing to repeat what you've just told me to Marshal Waters?" Dr. Morrison's face crumpled with terror. I can't. Nash has threatened my life if I speak against him. He knows things about my past, things that could ruin me even if I survived his retaliation." Clara felt her brief moment of hope collapse. "Then why are you telling me this? What good does it do if you won't testify?" "Because there might be evidence, documents. Nash keeps records of his business dealings in a safe at his house. If someone could get access to those papers—" "Someone like me, you mean? You're already a target. You have nothing left to lose." The casual dismissal of her life stung, but Clara had to admit there was truth in it. She was trapped in a protective custody that felt more like a jail cell with enemies on all sides and no real future in Millfield, even if she survived the current crisis. Where exactly would I find this safe? Nash's study on the second floor of his house. It's hidden behind a painting of a cattle drive. But Miss Clara, if you're caught, I'll be killed. Yes, I understand that. Clara stood and began pacing the small room. But I'll be killed anyway, if I just sit here waiting for Nash to try again. At least this way I might be able to take him down with me. Dr. Morrison rose to leave his face etched with shame and fear. I'm sorry it's come to this. I'm sorry for my part in bringing you to this point, Doctor, Clara called as he reached the door. If I do this, if I get the evidence, will you find the courage to use it? He paused his hand on the door handle. If you can prove Nash's crimes, if you can give me protection from his retaliation, yes, I'll testify. After he left, Clara sat in the gathering darkness of her room, weighing her options. The smart thing would be to wait for Marshal Waters to build his case through official channels. But she had no guarantee that Waters would be successful, and she knew that Nash would not wait indefinitely to make another attempt on her life. The plan that began to form in her mind was desperate and dangerous. But it offered something that passive waiting did not, the chance to take control of her own fate. If she was going to die in Millfield, she would at least die fighting. As night fell over the town, Clara began to prepare for what might be the last gamble of her life. Outside her window, the lights of Millfield twinkled peacefully, giving no hint of the corruption and violence that festered beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet frontier community. She thought once more of Nellie and Sam, probably getting ready for bed in their father's house, unaware that their former governess was planning to risk everything in a desperate attempt to expose the truth about their town. If she succeeded, she might finally clear her name and give them a chance at a better future. If she failed, they would likely never know what had really happened to the woman who had loved them like her own children. Either way, Clara knew that her time of passive suffering was over. Tonight, she would become the agent of her own deliverance or destruction. The guard change happened at midnight, just as Dr. Morrison had told her it would. Clara waited until she heard the muffled conversation between the departing deputy and his replacement, then gave it another hour to ensure that the new man had settled into his routine. Through her small window, she could see him sitting in a chair outside the jail's front door, his rifle across his knees, occasionally nodding as sleep threatened to claim him. Clara had spent the evening carefully examining every inch of her room, looking for a way out that wouldn't alert the guard. The window was barred, but the bars were set into the adobe wall with iron pins that had rusted over the years. Using the metal handle of the wash basin, she worked quietly to loosen one of the pins, trying to minimize the scraping sounds that might carry to the guard outside. It took nearly 2 hours of patient work, but finally the pin came free, allowing her to push one of the bars aside, just enough to squeeze through. The window was high enough off the ground that she had to hang from the sill and drop the last few feet, landing hard, but managing to keep from crying out. Millfield was eerily quiet. In the deep hours of the night, most of its citizens long since retired to their beds. Only a few windows showed light: the saloon, where a handful of die-hard drinkers were finishing their evening, the doctor's office, where a lamp burned to signal availability for emergencies, and Nash's mansion on the hill, where money never slept. Clara made her way through the back alleys, avoiding the main streets where her movement might be detected. The Nash house sat on a rise overlooking the town, a 2-story monument to wealth and power that seemed to loom over Millfield like a brooding giant. Getting inside proved easier than she had expected. Nash was apparently confident enough in his position that he didn't feel the need for elaborate security measures. A kitchen window on the ground floor had been left unlatched, probably by a servant who wanted to let in cool air during the stifling heat of the day. The interior of the house was lavishly appointed, filled with furniture that had clearly been shipped at great expense from eastern cities. Clara moved carefully through the darkened rooms, guided by moonlight, filtering through tall windows and her own desperate determination. She found the study on the second floor, exactly where Dr. Morrison had said it would be. The painting of the cattle drive hung on the wall behind Nash's massive oak desk, and when Clara lifted it aside, she found the safe set into the wall. The combination lock looked impossibly complex. But as Clara examined it more closely, she noticed that the metal around certain numbers was more worn than others, suggesting which digits were used regularly. After trying several combinations based on the worn numbers, she finally heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Inside the safe was a treasure trove of documents that confirmed everything Dr. Morrison had told her and much more. Railroad contracts, land deeds acquired through questionable means, correspondence with corrupt officials, and most damning of all, a ledger that detailed bribes paid to local citizens for their cooperation in various schemes. Clara's hands shook as she read through the evidence of Nash's criminal empire. He had been systematically corrupting or eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his plans to control the railroad development in the region. The Boyd Ranch was just one small piece of a much larger conspiracy that reached all the way to the territorial capital. As she carefully gathered the most incriminating documents, Clara heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she had been discovered. Moving as quietly as possible, she stuffed the papers inside her dress and tried to think of an escape route. The footsteps paused outside the study door, and Clara heard the soft click of a gun being cocked. Whoever was out there knew she was inside and was prepared to kill her on sight. "Come out slowly," a voice commanded. "Hands where I can see them." Clara recognized the voice of Tom Crenshaw, apparently free from jail and back to doing Nash's dirty work. She wondered how much Nash had paid to secure his release, and how many other officials were in his pocket. With no other choice, Clara stepped out of the study with her hands raised. Tom stood at the top of the stairs, his rifle pointed directly at her chest. His young face was flushed with excitement at the prospect of completing the job he had bungled in the desert. "Well, well," he said with a nasty grin. "Looks like we caught ourselves a thief. Mr. Nash is going to be real interested to hear about this. I suppose he's going to want to deal with me personally." Clara said, stalling for time while her mind raced for any possible escape. "Oh no." Tom laughed. "He said if we caught you, we should handle the problem permanently. No more mistakes, no more complications. Just a quick bullet and a shallow grave." Clara's blood turned to ice as she realized that Nash had decided to dispense with subtlety altogether. There would be no elaborate schemes to discredit her, no attempts to drive her out of town, just cold-blooded murder carried out by a barely literate teenager drunk on his own sense of power. "Before you kill me," Clara said, "don't you want to know what I found in that safe?" Tom's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you talking about?" "Evidence. Proof of crimes that reach all the way to the territorial government. Nash isn't just stealing land, he's bribing officials, forging documents, maybe even murder. If I disappear tonight, that evidence is going to surface anyway." "You're lying," Tom said, but Clara could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "Am I? Do you really think Nash tells you everything about his business? You're just muscle, Tom. Expendable. What happens to you when the federal marshals start investigating Nash's operation?" The young man's rifle wavered slightly as doubt began to eat at his confidence. Clara pressed her advantage, taking a small step closer. "Help me get this evidence to Marshal Waters, and you might survive what's coming. Keep following Nash's orders, and you'll end up in federal prison or dead when he decides you know too much." "Shut up," Tom snapped, raising the rifle again. "I don't care about any of that. Nash pays well, and that's all I need to know." Clara saw in his eyes that her words hadn't swayed him. He was too young and too stupid to see beyond his immediate payoff. She was going to die in this hallway, and the evidence she had gathered would die with her. As Tom's finger tightened on the trigger, the front door of the house burst open with a thunderous crash. Heavy boots pounded across the floor below, and Clara heard Marshal Waters' voice booming through the house. Federal marshals, everyone freeze. Tom spun toward the stairs, momentarily distracted by the unexpected arrival of the law. Clara didn't waste the opportunity. She lunged forward and grabbed for the rifle, her desperation giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. The weapon went off as they struggled, the bullet gouging a chunk out of the wall. Tom was stronger, but Clara fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. She clawed at his face, drove her knee into his stomach, and finally managed to wrest the rifle away from him. By the time Marshal Waters and his deputies reached the second floor, they found Clara holding Tom at gunpoint, while he cowered against the wall, blood streaming from the scratches she had left on his face. "Miss Clara," Waters said, lowering his own weapon. "Are you all right?" "I'm alive," she replied, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "And I have evidence documents from Nash's safe that prove everything." As she handed over the papers she had risked her life to obtain, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since arriving in Millfield, she had struck back at the forces that had tried to destroy her. The evidence in those documents would bring down Nash's criminal empire and finally clear her name. But even as relief flooded through her, Clara knew that the danger was far from over. Nash was still free, still powerful, and still perfectly capable of eliminating anyone who threatened his interests. The real battle was just beginning, and before it was over, more blood would be shed in the dusty streets of Millfield. Dawn was breaking over the desert as Marshal Waters finished examining the documents Clara had retrieved from Nash's safe. The evidence was even more damning than he had hoped, detailed records of bribes, forged land deeds, and correspondence that implicated corrupt officials throughout the territory. "This is enough to put Nash away for the rest of his life," Waters told Clara as they sat in his office. "Railroad fraud, bribery of federal officials, conspiracy to commit murder. He'll be lucky if he doesn't hang." Clara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that celebrating was premature. Marshal Nash didn't build this empire by giving up easily. He's going to fight back, and he's going to be desperate. Waters' expression grew grim. "I know. That's why I'm keeping you under protection until we can arrest him. But he can't have gotten far. I've had men watching his house since before dawn." A commotion outside the office interrupted their conversation. Deputy Martinez burst through the door, his face pale with alarm. "Marshal, we've got a problem. Nash is gone. Looks like he cleared out sometime during the night. But that's not the worst part." "What's the worst part?" Waters demanded. "He's got the Boyd children, Nellie and Sam. Left a note saying if we want them back alive, we'll meet him at the old mining camp in Devil's Canyon at noon." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the marshal's words hit her like a physical blow. Nash had taken the two innocent children she loved more than her own life, planning to use them as bargaining chips in his desperate attempt to escape justice. He wants to trade them for the documents. She said, though, even as she spoke, she knew it was more complicated than that. "But he can't let any of us live. We know too much." Waters was already strapping on his gun belt and checking his weapons. "Martinez, round up every deputy we can find. Send word to the territorial capital. I want federal backup here as fast as possible." "Marshal," Clara said, rising from her chair, "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You're a civilian, and you're the primary target of this whole conspiracy. I'm not putting you in more danger." "Those children are in danger because of me," Clara said fiercely. "Nash took them to get to me. I won't sit here safely while they suffer for my choices." Waters studied her determined face and seemed to recognize that arguing would be futile. "All right. But you stay back when the shooting starts, and you follow my orders without question." As they prepared to ride out to Devil's Canyon, Clara thought about Nellie and Sam, probably terrified and confused about why they had been taken from their beds in the middle of the night. She had tried so hard to protect them from the violence and corruption that seemed to infect everything in Millfield. But now, they were at the center of it, through no fault of their own. The old mining camp sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering red cliffs that made it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. It had been abandoned for years after the silver vein played out, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and rusted equipment that provided plenty of cover for someone planning an ambush. As Waters and his men took positions around the canyon rim, Clara could see Nash's men moving among the buildings below. She counted at least 6 armed men, including Nash himself, all positioned to have clear fields of fire on anyone approaching the camp. Through the marshal's telescope, Clara could see Nellie and Sam tied to posts in the center of the camp, then their small forms dwarfed by the massive mining equipment around them. Even from a distance, she could see that they were frightened, but unharmed for now. "He's smart," Waters murmured, studying the scene below. "Good defensive position hostages in the open where we can't risk gunfire. If we try a direct assault, those children are dead. So what do? We negotiate. Try to get him to release the children in exchange for safe passage out of the territory." Clara knew that Nash would never agree to such a deal. He was too smart to believe that federal marshals would honor an agreement made under duress. But perhaps they could buy enough time for reinforcements to arrive, or for an opportunity to present itself. Waters cupped his hands around his mouth and called down to the camp below. "Nash, this is Marshal Waters. Let's talk." A figure emerged from behind one of the buildings, Nash himself holding a rifle, and using Nellie as a human shield. Even from their elevated position, Clara could see the little girl's terrified face. "Talk away, Marshal," Nash shouted back. "But keep it simple. I want Clara Hart and all the documents she stole from my house. In exchange, the children live." "You know I can't do that, Nash. But I can guarantee you safe passage out of the territory if you release those children unharmed." Nash's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Safe passage, Marshal. I've been planning for this day for months. I have money-hidden contacts in Mexico, everything I need to disappear. What I don't have is time to waste on meaningless negotiations." Clara watched in horror as Nash pressed the barrel of his rifle against Nellie's head. The little girl stood perfectly still, her training as a frontier child telling her that any sudden movement might mean death. "Then you'll try to shoot me. I'll kill you in self-defense, and your $40 won't matter much anymore." As Nash disappeared back into cover, Clara felt her heart breaking for the children who had become pawns in this deadly game. She had seen enough frontier violence to know that Nash was absolutely capable of carrying out his threats. "I have to go down there," she said quietly. Waters shook his head. "It's a trap. He'll kill you and the children both." "Maybe. But if I don't go, he'll definitely kill them. At least this way there's a chance." The marshal was quiet for a long moment, studying the terrain below and weighing their limited options. Finally he spoke. "There might be another way. That old mine shaft on the eastern side of the camp, if we could get someone inside through there, they might be able to create enough distraction for us to move on the children." Clara followed his gaze to the dark opening in the cliff face. "How do we know it connects to the camp?" "We don't, but it's worth a try. Martinez, take 2 men and see if you can work your way through that mine. Give us a signal when you're in position." As the deputy and his men began their dangerous journey through the abandoned mine workings, Clara kept her eyes fixed on Nellie and Sam. She could see them talking quietly to each other, the older girl obviously trying to comfort her little brother. Their courage in the face of such terror made Clara's chest tight with pride and fear. The hour Nash had given them crawled by with agonizing slowness. When Martinez finally signaled that his team was in position inside the mine, the sun was directly overhead, casting short shadows that provided little cover for any rescue attempt. "And this is it," Waters said grimly. "When Martinez makes his move, we'll have maybe 30 seconds to get to those children before Nash realizes what's happening." Clara checked the rifle Waters had given her, though she prayed she wouldn't have to use it. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Frontier life had a way of teaching people to function under pressure. The explosion that marked the beginning of their assault came from the direction of the mine shaft, sending smoke and debris billowing across the camp. Nash's men immediately turned their attention toward this new threat, giving Waters and his deputies the opening they needed. Clara ran down the slope toward the children, her feet sliding on loose rock as bullets began flying around her. She could hear Waters shouting orders to his men, could hear Nash screaming for someone to kill the woman running toward the hostages. She reached Nellie and Sam just as Nash himself emerged from cover, his rifle trained on Clara's chest. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the hatred burning in his eyes as he prepared to end her life. The shot that rang out across the canyon didn't come from Nash's rifle. Dr. Morrison stepped out from behind a pile of mining equipment, a smoking pistol in his shaking hands, and Nash's body crumpling to the ground behind him. "I couldn't let him kill you." The doctor said, his voice barely audible over the continuing gunfire. "Not after everything I've done." Clara quickly cut the ropes, binding the children, gathering them into her arms as bullets continued to fly around them. Nellie and Sam clung to her with desperate strength, their small bodies shaking with relief and terror. "It's over," Clara whispered into their hair, though the gunfight was still raging around them. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." As Marshal Waters and his men systematically eliminated Nash's remaining followers, Clara held the children close and watched the sun set over Devil's Canyon. The nightmare that had begun with her arrival in Millfield was finally coming to an end, though the cost in blood and pain had been higher than anyone could have imagined. But as she looked down at Nellie and Sam's tear-streaked faces, Clara knew that some things were worth any price. These children were alive. Nash's criminal empire had been destroyed. And for the first time since stepping off the train in Millfield, she could imagine a future that didn't involve running or hiding. The battle was over, but the work of healing was just beginning. The days following the confrontation at Devil's Canyon passed in a blur of statements, investigations, and revelations that shook Millfield to its foundations. Nash's documents revealed a web of corruption that implicated dozens of prominent citizens, from the town banker, who had been laundering money, to the judge, who had been bought and paid for, long before Clara ever arrived in town. Mrs. Ashcroft, confronted with evidence of her own involvement in Nash's schemes, broke down completely and confessed to taking bribes in exchange for using her influence to drive undesirable women out of town. Clara learned that she hadn't been Nash's first target. There had been others, women whose only crime had been inconveniencing powerful men's plans. Dr. Morrison, despite his role in bringing down Nash, faced his own reckoning. His confession revealed that he had been blackmailed into participating in the conspiracy, threatened with exposure of his forged medical credentials and the gambling debts that had driven him west in the first place. But his final act of courage in saving Clara and the children earned him a measure of redemption, and Marshal Waters arranged for him to serve his sentence by providing medical care to remote frontier communities under federal supervision. Harlan Boyd struggled with the revelation that his weakness and cowardice had nearly cost Clara her life and had put his own children in mortal danger. The guilt ate at him like acid, but slowly, with Clara's patient help, he began to find the strength to be the father and man his family needed. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he told Clara one evening as they sat on the porch of his ranch house watching Nellie and Sam play in the yard. "I stood by and let them destroy you because I was too afraid to stand up for what was right." Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking about forgiveness and the price of holding on to anger. "Harlan, what happened to me wasn't about what I deserved or didn't deserve. It was about powerful people protecting their interests. You were as much a victim of their manipulation as I was, but I should have been stronger. I should have protected you." "Yes," Clara agreed simply. "You should have. But you're being stronger now, and that's what matters. Your children need a father who will fight for them, who will stand up to bullies and corrupt officials. They need to see that it's never too late to choose courage over cowardice." The healing process wasn't limited to individuals. Millfield itself began to change as the full scope of Nash's corruption became clear. The Virtue Committee was disbanded, its moral authority thoroughly discredited. New leadership emerged from among the townspeople who had maintained their integrity, despite the pressure to conform to Nash's vision of order. Maria Morales, the Mexican woman who ran the town's bakery, was elected to the town council, the first person of Hispanic heritage to hold such a position in Millfield's history. Her first act was to propose the establishment of a school that would welcome children regardless of their background or social status. Education is the only real weapon against ignorance and hatred, she told the packed town hall meeting where the proposal was debated. If we want to prevent another Nash from taking control of our community, we need citizens who can think for themselves. Clara found herself at the center of these changes, no longer the pariah who had been driven from decent society, but a symbol of resistance against corruption and injustice. The scarlet letter that had been pinned to her shawl in shame was quietly preserved and displayed in the new school, as a reminder of what happened when communities allowed fear and prejudice to override justice and compassion. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of healing came on a quiet Sunday morning when Nellie approached Clara with a small wrapped package. "I made this for you." The little girl said, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only children can maintain after surviving trauma. "Papa helped me with the hard parts." Inside the wrapping was a small wooden box, carefully carved and polished by young hands. When Clara opened it, she found the red cloth that had marked her as a fallen woman, but now it had been transformed into something else entirely, a small pillow, on which rested a handful of seeds. "They're flower seeds," Nellie explained. "Papa said you could plant them anywhere you wanted, and they'd grow into something beautiful. I thought maybe you could plant them where they made you wear that mean old cloth, and then something good would grow there instead." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she held the box, understanding the profound symbolism of what this child had created. From the symbol of her shame, something beautiful could indeed grow hope, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption for both individuals and communities. That afternoon, Clara walked to the spot in front of Peterson's general store where the mob had first attacked her. A small crowd gathered as word spread about what she was planning to do. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt for their role in her persecution, and still others out of genuine desire to witness this act of healing. Clara knelt in the dusty street and carefully removed the red cloth from the box. As she pressed the seeds into the hard-packed earth, she spoke quietly but clearly enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "I plant these seeds not in anger, but in hope. Hope that this community can grow beyond the fear and hatred that nearly destroyed us all. Hope that the children of Millfield will inherit a better world than the one we've known." She buried the cloth beneath the seeds, literally and symbolically transforming the marker of her shame into the foundation for new growth. As she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, Nellie and Sam ran to stand beside her, their small hands slipping into hers with perfect trust. "What you meant to destroy," Clara said, looking at the faces in the crowd, some ashamed, some defiant, but many showing the first signs of genuine remorse and change. "I make the soil where the broken can rise." The crowd was quiet for a long moment, before Maria Morales began to clap her applause, soon joined by others, until the street rang with the sound of recognition and approval. It wasn't forgiveness in the sense of forgetting what had happened, but acknowledgement that healing was possible if people were willing to do the hard work of becoming better than they had been. As the gathering dispersed, Harlan approached Clara with tears in his eyes. "I know I have no right to ask this after everything that's happened, but would you consider staying? The children love you, and this town needs people like you. People who won't compromise their principles, no matter how much pressure they face." Clara looked at the man who had brought her to Millfield as a mail-order bride, but had failed to protect her when she needed it most. She saw in his face genuine remorse and the beginning of real strength. More importantly, she saw the possibility of building something real and lasting with him and his children. "I'll stay," she said simply. but not as your mail-order bride or as a convenience for your household. If I stay, it's as an equal partner in whatever we build together." Harlan nodded, understanding that he was being offered something far more valuable than what he had originally sought, not a subservient helpmate, but a true companion who would challenge him to be better than he had been. As they walked back to the ranch together with Nellie and Sam running ahead and the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desert, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Millfield. Genuine peace. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges and obstacles, but it was a future she would face with dignity and strength, surrounded by people who had learned to value those qualities above conformity and fear. 6 months later, the flowers that had grown from the seeds Nellie gave her bloomed in brilliant colors in front of Peterson's store, drawing visitors from across the territory who came to hear the story of the woman who had transformed shame into hope. Children from the new integrated school would often sit among the flowers during recess, learning their lessons in the shadow of a living reminder that courage and compassion could overcome even the deepest darkness. And sometimes, when the desert wind blew just right, visitors would swear they could hear the sound of children's laughter carried on the air, and the laughter of young people growing up in a community that had learned through great pain and at great cost the difference between justice and revenge, between strength and cruelty, between the letter of judgment and the spirit of grace. Clara Hart had come to Millfield as a stranger seeking a new beginning. She stayed as a teacher, a mother, and a living testament to the possibility that even in the harshest landscapes, with enough patience and care, anything could bloom.